The most happy of Fridays possible in this universe, I am wishing to you today, especially since we're kind of following through with what we started over the last 2 weeks. When Arlene Filkoff was here with us last week, telling us some cooking stories, some recipe stories, and that was preceded by Rick Bragg. Well, here's the perfect meal. We're having Rick Bragg for dessert. And I am going to read to you a brief passage and then a little smidge from this absolutely wonderful book. This is the 6th chapter, and it is The Fourth Bear. Cornmeal porridge with chicken and watercress, stewed cabbage, and fried apples. This is from 1926. It was a damn dicey time to be a chicken with an attitude. We'll need one, a fat one if we can catch one, the old man said. Girl came back in about 20 minutes with another rooster. She had her eye on him. Now, he told her, I'll learn you how to make porridge. Like the story about them bears, she asked. No, he said, not altogether sure what bears had to do with anything. He had eaten bear as a boy, and it was loathsome, strong and oily, with an essence of what seemed to be axle grease. Literature, and especially fairy tales, did not figure in the old man's experiences. Last books in the Bundrum family had been left behind long ago in Virginia as the family drifted south during the previous century. Oh, even the name had changed as that literacy slid away from the original Bondron to Bundrum, as if it had been blurred or muddled somehow on a page, soaked with corn whiskey. But porridge had been in the family history forever, it seemed, on both sides of a wide, deep ocean. Our people called it merely broth, because of the chicken stock that is in its 20th century foundation. But its origins envelop just about everything. Now, my European ancestors, French, English, Irish, German, Viking, they lived on it, but flavored with pork fat or poached game. The Creek and the Cherokee, who are just as much a part of our lineage as the Europeans, ate it flavored with squirrel and often with quail, and even with doves. But the best it ever was, my people believe, was with a good fat chicken, or, barring that, a tough and stringy one, and maybe a few aromatics to season it with. It required no sides, just a bowl and a spoon. Now, the old man, though, liked to eat it with a savory side or two, like stewed cabbage, which was mildly sweet and a fine complement to his simple porridge, and apples fried in butter and cinnamon, which he said was like having dessert, but not having to wait on it. To Ava, the porridge sounded like a terrible notion, like the meals the evil kings fed to their prisoners in the dungeon. They called it gruel. It ain't like chain gang food, is it? You know, like mush? Because we had some kin on a chain gang, and they said all they had to eat was mush and white beans and beets and such. He told her to hush. And no, it wasn't. She could wait and see, but mostly Hush. It's cheap food, surely, but you need to learn to cook cheap food. Times will always get hard, harder than regular, he said, as if he could feel a coming depression in his bones. But cook it rich, he said, and you won't need as much meat, and you won't need as much of nothing else. Now, the meaning of that would become especially clear to her in the worst of times. The meal could be made with either cornmeal or flour, but the cornmeal version, he believed, was more savory, more satisfying. The flour recipe was similar in consistency to the broth with dumplings. Never have liked dumplings, he said. Pasty-tasting bastards. Since they had only the liver and gizzard from the one bird, there was not enough to fry. So, old man set him aside to use as bait on his trot lines. Now, they would not do in the stock pot, he said, because they would muddy up the clean taste of the chicken broth, especially the heavy, murky taste in the liver. He liked his coffee like tar and smoked cheap, strong tobacco that would all but knock birds from the sky, and he could out-curse any other man she had ever known. But he was not ham-handed as to food. Now, it may be, all in all, he really was just an excellent fish camp cook, akin to all those fine short-order chefs who work the truck stops. But the old man had a light touch for such an unapologetic ruffian. He even understood the value in a little fresh-picked watercress. Now, it seemed to Ava to be a puzzling ingredient, not just for porridge, but for almost anything. Peppery taste seemed to go with nothing. He had gone to the creek to pick it himself from the cold water, but came back with a bunch so small he could hold it in one hand, more like a bouquet than something a grown man had put in a pot. Well, he boiled it first, then fried it quickly in bacon grease. He diced it with a sharp knife, ending up with a handful or less of what looked more like wilted parsley, and set it aside. He showed her how to season the water and boil the chicken with a little onion and a dear store-bought carrot, and how to bone and break the chicken into pieces without burning herself. Then he returned the chicken to the stock and sprinkled the watercress into the broth. The only real trick was in combining the chicken stock with a mixture of seasoned cornmeal stirred into cool water. It had to be done slowly and carefully, because in this dish the consistency mattered as much as the seasoning. He looked down to a smooth, creamy consistency. Now, the key ingredient, he told her, was a 1/4 pound of the pure cow's butter that they had churned themselves, which magnified and complemented the richness of the broth. As the porridge slowly bubbled, pushed to the side of the stove, he washed, chopped, and stewed a head of white cabbage in a daub of bacon grease, frying it a little to, get it going, add some flavor, and improve the sweetness a bit, but finishing it more with hot steam than with grease. It's plain food, cabbage is, but not plain tastin', he said. I cooked it all my life, but I ain't never seen none throwed out. Apples, easy. A forgiving dish and good for the late fall and early winter, especially after the garden had already given up all but a few winter vegetables. He worked fast, cutting and coring, but he left the skins on, then fried them in butter, bacon grease, and sugar. "Where's that damn cinnamon?" he almost shouted as he stirred. Ava just shrugged. Insulted. She knew cinnamon and had used it in her previous life. Cakes and pies were the only dishes she had paid much attention to when she was a child, but it was so odd, too, the old pie knot asking for a pinch of cinnamon. She laughed out loud. "Where's the damn cinnamon?" she shouted back. And the old man wondered, not for the first time, if the girl might be truly mad. It was hard to tell under such a great mustache if he smiled. But he did not murder her, so he might have been amused. Now, the finished porridge was the consistency of warm pudding with tender chicken in every bite. The old man said it was good to thicken it enough so that they could use a fork, so as to make it easy to eat beside the cabbage and apples. As they spooned it up, she told the old man and the boy the story of the bears and the blonde-haired little girl. Oh, and the porridge that was too hot, too cold, and just right. We do not know if he enjoyed the story, but he did question it. Why, he wanted to know, did the bears not just eat the little girl, since they had her already hemmed in good? When I was a little boy, and she told the story to us, she always strayed from the plot and talked to my great-grandfather and his porridge like he was just another character. You know, kind of like the fourth bear. Now, the recipes follow for cornmeal porridge with chicken and watercress. And as usual, this book tells you what you'll need and how to cook it. Stewed cabbage, what you need, how to cook it. Fried apples, what you need, and how to cook it. He emptied the contents of his own memory into his teaching, showing her not just how to get by, to keep his body and the children from going hungry, but the foundation of life itself in this bare-knuckle place. Preachers could worry about their souls, he said. There's no point in rushing into it. They would need, in the years ahead, every inch of the landscape around them. He taught her how to find food deep in the woods, in the creeping vines, and the wild fruit trees, and even in the weeds. He showed her what was good to eat and what would at least keep them alive when there was nothing else, and what would kill them if he made a mistake. It became part of her. My mama loved that old man. I know that. She said it many times. My mother said. I don't truly know if she ever told him that. You know, they was a lot alike, them two. Like they were blood kin themselves. It was that invisible, unwritten book of recipes that bound them, at least as tight as blood, which had rarely seemed to mean that much to the old man anyway. But even that had seemed to change, pot by pot. He taught her biscuits, stewed okra, catfish fried in a spicy stew, and fried green tomatoes, squash, and baked backbone, and black-eyed peas. He sacrificed many, many a mysterious chicken, and the boy would walk in the door day after day to glorious smells. Now, a romantic would say it was how the old man made amends for leaving his family. But then we do like to grind the rough edges off the dead down here, if you give us time. Still, some of his kin say he never left his people a thing except a few welts and bruises and a legacy of violence. But they never said that in front of her. At least, not more than once. No amount of polishing would make him a saint, or even less a sinner in some things. As the hard times did descend and worsen, no one wanted a good roofer, or carpenter, or a well digger, and the demand for timber bottomed out. Then, because this is just the way luck will do you, disease ran through their small flock of chickens, and they died one by one. They lived off their garden, watched their one hog closely with trepidation. Ava had never been poor, and it was raw and ugly to her. One day, the old man told Ava and his son he believed he would saunter down onto the neighbors and have a good little chat if he was to catch 'em outside. They found this especially odd, since the old man did not chat and would rather eat dirt than make small talk. It all tasted the same in his mouth. He rarely even returned a wave with little more than an almost imperceptible nod, fearing it would be seen as an invitation of some kind to continue the worrisome interaction. Later they saw him coming up the road at a distance, but at an odd gait. And as long as he got closer, it became clear he was carrying something. It was a chicken wire cage, crammed with sad, scraggly chickens. Once in the yard, the old man laid down his burden, turned the chickens loose to spread through the handful that had followed behind him, and turned out one pocket to sprinkle the last handful of crushed corn across the yard. Being chickens, they probably thought they had merely traveled in a circle and were home again. Ava feared the worst. But the old man told her he had swapped for them, fair and square. She spent most of the next day waiting for someone to come into the yard to reclaim their property. The day passed into night, and no one came. Only then did she notice the old man was not wearing his great wool coat. And her heart broke just the slightest bit. But just in case, she sat beside him on the porch to watch the chickens peck. And then she began to choose. Now, I have one real quick little bit, if I can find it, that I do want to share with you. Turn the page down and I'll be jiggered if I can find it. I found it. Now here's another story from a different chapter, and I tell you the treasures in each of these chapters. Oh, You just need to read through to the end of this book. Here's the part I wanted to share with you in closing. My people tell a story about the great ever after, one that reminds my mother of Sis. Now, in the story, a rich, selfish man is condemned to hell and is ushered into an endless dining hall. He sees a great banquet laid out before the assembled people there, a feast, a dripping roasted meats and savory soups and sumptuous stews. The devil's imps file down the table to pass out spoons. But the spoons are longer than the arms of the men and women gathered there. They cannot, hard as they try, get the delicious food into their mouths. And a great wailing and gnashing of teeth echoes and echoes through the great hall. Now, meanwhile, in heaven, St. Peter welcomes another new arrival, a common and a generous man, into a similar great long banquet hall. The newcomer comes, sees another grand feast laid out before the diners assembled there. But disconcertingly, the man sees the waiters pass out the same spoons as the one passed out to the diners in hell. Now, all of them too long for people to feed themselves. How then, the crestfallen man asked St. Peter, can this be heaven? St. Peter smiles. Because in heaven, he says, we feed each other. See, I'll go now to the banquet of life, and you feed some of your friends. We'll see you next Friday.